Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Goulet. I'm Director of Member Relations and Research at PFC. Today we're hosting a conversation with 4 panelists who are going to offer their experience and insight on working with non-qualified donees. And the webinar is being hosted by Hanifa Kassam, who's been consulting with PFC on various things, DEI and working with non-qualified donees as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out 2 things. First of all, this is not a session on the legal or technical aspects of working with non-qualified donees. We actually had a previous session on that on March 26th. And I think my colleague Valerie will put the link to that particular recording in the chat box. So if you're interested in anything relating to the tax and legal issues, there were 2 charity lawyers that hosted that session for us. So please, consult that webinar if you're interested in the tax and legal aspects of it. Second, this webinar is intended to build on that one. So this is a very, practical, conversational, personal experiences from our panelists on working with non-qualified donees. And it's also, builds on a tool that we're currently working on with Hanifa on, it's a toolkit on the how-to on working with non-qualified donees. So that should be released in the next few weeks or so. So if you're interested, please subscribe to our weekly digest and you'll see exactly when that new guide is going to be launched. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Hanifa so she can get the conversation started. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session. We'll put a little bit of time and we'll address as many of your questions as possible. But we'll let Hanifa get started with her conversation and our panelists. So thank you all for joining us. Hanifa?
Great, thank you, Lisa and PFC for creating space for this conversation to happen, and welcome to all of our participants and panelists for today. To begin, I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge the many treaties of Turtle Island on which we work and reside. These treaties, oh man, sorry guys. My screen is too small for me to read the text.
Okay, would you like me to take over?
I'm gonna start over, and I'm okay with that. So hopefully everyone else is okay as well. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island on which we work and reside. These territories, ceded and unceded, are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous people of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together. So again, welcome and thank you for your patience. I'd like to begin by starting with a brief introduction as to why we're hosting this session alongside of conversations that have already been begun by PFC earlier in the pandemic, but also as a way to highlight the importance of working with non-charity organizations. However, in order to do so, I think it's important to give some background, but also some language to help ground the conversation that we are about to have with the amazing panelists whom we will introduce shortly. COVID-19 has served to exacerbate the challenges and barriers that vulnerable communities were already experiencing every day before this public health crisis, and has created new challenges that compound the existing vulnerabilities. Despite this, communities and individuals, since the onset of COVID-19, has demonstrated significant resilience, exemplified by the work of grassroots and mutual aid groups that are at the forefront of responding to COVID-19. Many groups and individuals that are assisting communities to respond to the pandemic are not charities registered with the Canada Revenue Agency. These groups are referred to as non-qualified donees. During our conversation today, I will use the term non-charity to refer to these groups. But more explicitly, as you will see on the screen, is we provided you with a definition of what a non-qualified donee is. And I would like to highlight that these groups are explicitly groups, again, that are not groups with charitable registration numbers, but are a part of our social fabric in terms of addressing the social and economic needs of residents and communities across Canada. Next slide, please. To compare that to qualified donees, this slide highlights what qualified donees are, and in particular, these are organizations that do have a charitable registration number with the Canada Revenue Agency. So we're not going to spend too much time on this, but I thought it was important to start off with ensuring that folks that are participating in today's call and that are listening are aware of the types of groups that make up the space that we're talking about today, but in particular, acknowledge and understand that we are focused on working and talking about here today organizations that are non-charities. Next slide, please. As Lisa mentioned in her introduction, today's conversation is a follow-up to a legal and technical webinar that was held earlier this year in March. Today's panelists join us and will share a range of perspectives on working with charity groups as well as non-charity groups. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite each panelist to share what brings them today to this conversation, and in particular, what has their experience been in working with non-charities briefly. And we're gonna go in the order of Ajiv, Ikem, Michelle, and Bridget. Ajiv, would you like to start us?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Super grateful that you're all here and spending some time with us today. I come at this conversation, I think, through a variety of angles and perspectives. I was once a co-lead on a grassroots group out in Toronto, out East Scarborough. And so we were a non-qualified donee, and we worked with a trustee for that bit of time. I was also a former employee of the East Scarborough Storefront. The Storefront is a community backbone organization in East Scarborough in Toronto. And they are all about advancing the priorities of residents, of grassroots leaders in that community. And so one of the models that they spearheaded between 2010 and 2015 is called Neighborhood Trust, which was a shared platform to support resident-led groups to access funding, but also receive mentorship and support around navigating kind of the nonprofit sector and doing their work. So there's that kind of shared platform model of the Storefront. I've also spent some time in philanthropy working at the Laidlaw Foundation. Laidlaw Foundation, which I'm sure you'll hear lots about today on this webinar, is a private family foundation. And one of the really unique things about them is that they have an internal process where they're able to actually fund non-qualified donees directly. And so as a person working as a staff member in the foundation, I had my hands deep in a lot of the programs and worked with, I'd say about 50% of the grantees I worked with were non-qualified donees. So that was a very unique experience. But yes, there are foundations funding non-qualified donees right now. It's a good practice. It's not the best. It can be better. But yes, it's happening. And finally, my role at Center for Connected Communities as a manager of policy and community connections, where our purpose is really to help people, organizations, and institutions unlock the effectiveness of connected communities by using the connected community approach, is really rooted in kind of collective solutions to complex social issues. And this really requires for us contributing to the space that governments, institutions, social service organizations can't be doing their work in isolation of grassroots groups that exist in neighborhoods and in society more broadly. And so our work is about helping those institutions and organizations see the work of grassroots groups, amplify and surface that work that's often invisible, and support them on designing process meaningfully in partnership with these groups so that they can help inform kind of solutions to broader social issues. So, I think over the course of a decade of doing this work, I've always had one foot in the conversation of working with non-charities to solve complex social problems. So that's all I'll say for now, and we can continue the conversation. Great,
thank you, Ajeev. Iken?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here as well. And thank you for joining us, everybody. How I come to this conversation is kind of related to me introducing myself. Part of my path has been through community development, working with youth here in Toronto, and then taking a path through international development and partnering with sometimes the partnerships were simultaneously with Canadian charities, organizations in Latin America and in Africa that would be considered non-qualified donees here or there, and also large governmental institutions. So many of those partners had those partnerships had a lot of moving parts and had a lot of players of different sizes working together in community to do the work that was necessary. So one of the things that I noticed that I think is germane to our conversation today was the fact that there quite frankly was very little difference in terms of the capacity, commitment to the work, and the proximity to looking for solutions and unlocking the potential that exists in community, regardless of whether a group was designated qualified, non-qualified, or not. So I think that's part of what my experience has been with coming into this conversation, was how we push a bit at that notion of what it means to be a qualified or non-charity, and how that frames the kinds of relationships and partnerships that we enter into with agents and agencies in community. Right now at the Youth Opportunities Fund, which is a part of the Ontario Trillium Foundation, my work is primarily with grassroots groups who are non-charities. Many of them are non-charities. In fact, most of them are non-charities. And it is interesting because our processes and the legislations that bind us as an organization actually prohibit us from funding those non-qualified donees directly. So we have mechanisms through which we fund them through intermediaries, through organizational mentors, and through partners in community. So part of my experience has been also figuring out how we leverage the networks that we have to reach and access those people who are and those groups who have the most proximity to the issues in community, and to support them to achieve.
Great, thank you, Iken. Michelle, if you could start with your organization, that would be great.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to PFC, and hello everyone. My name is Michelle Clark, and I'm the Executive Director of the Burns Memorial Fund. The Burns Memorial Fund is a Calgary-based charity that works with low-income children and youth to improve the health, education, and well-being of low-income children and youth. And I've been interested in this issue for a long time. I've always been a little bit frustrated on the funding side by the fact that it's so difficult to fund and support non-qualified donees, or non-charities, I think is a better phrase, because we're effectively leaving out a whole swath of important and interesting organizations who could contribute a lot to the work that we're doing in the social services sector in particular. So about 5 years ago, a group of us in Calgary, including other funders, charities and non-charities, decided to produce a handbook to make it easier for organizations to do this work. And the reason we did that is as a group, as a collective, we realized that people didn't really understand the rules. They didn't understand that you can in fact do this. And so they had a lot of fear, they had a lot of reluctance to do it, and they were worried about losing their charitable status. Charities were, and non-charities weren't even clear about how they could approach a charity and what what might be involved in that. So we thought that if we produced a handbook with a very practical guidance and examples and tools of how to do this, then perhaps we could encourage and foster better partnerships between charities and non-charities, and then allow for more innovation and more collaboration. Because I think right now, our rules are so rigorous and our understanding of them is so limited that we're actually cutting off the potential for innovation in the sector. So this group got together, we produced a handbook, which I think PFC is going to make that link available. We really thought that maybe within a year or so, the handbook would be out of date because the regulations would finally be modernized and we could, it would make this work easier. But sadly for us, the regulations are still pretty well the same. So the handbook should still be fairly useful to people.
Thank you, Michelle. Bridget?
Hi, everyone. So for today, I'm wearing two hats. One is that I'm the VP of Laidlaw Foundation that Ajeev gave a brief background to. I sit on the board of Laidlaw, and for granting, it's really set up to support young people that are impacted by the justice, education, and child welfare system, and really looking to support those that are doing youth-centered or youth-led work. So many of which Ajeev has already mentioned are non-charitable or grassroots-led organizations. I also am the vice president at Toronto Neighbourhood Group, which some folks might know better as Central Neighbourhood House or St. Stephen's Community House. And within that organization, I had started what we call Level Up Trustee Hub. And the Trustee Hub is a kind of an adjacent arm of St. Stephen's Community House that trustees grassroots organizations and lends the infrastructure of the larger organization to grassroots organizers. So that's HR, finance, governance, professional practice, in order for grassroots organizers to be able to focus on the work that they want to be doing and have the support from the back office supports. Currently, we trustee up to 32 organizations, and all of which are in Toronto, many of which are responding to some of the most complex issues in Toronto that both youth and adults face. There's a large contingent of youth-run organizations as part of Level Up and Trustee Hub, but it does span all different types of organizations, different size and scale of organizations, some of which are working with a $10,000 budget and some of which are working with close to $1 million budget. So there's, I come to this conversation really looking at it from both ends, as a granting body, but also as an arm to support on the ground the workings of grassroots organizers. I also have, if you see me coming and going, it's because I have a dog that wants to go outside all the time and children. And so I'm turning my camera on and off. I am here, I'm listening, very excited to hear the conversation.
Great, thank you, Bridget. And thank you for letting us know that you're here. So I just wanted to give folks a sense of the arc of today's webinar. As you can see and have heard, we're starting with introductions, but we're gonna move into learning a little bit about each panelist's perspective on the role that non-charities play in Canada's social infrastructure. We're then going to move into conversation about how working with non-charities has shaped the organizations to which they've mentioned today in their introductions. And then we're going to close with, what are our panelists' call to action around how philanthropy can do better in terms of working with non-charities moving forward and why this is the moment to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn to Akeem to start off with our next question, which is around, to you, what does it mean to work with non-charities in the context of what our social fabric is across Canada?
Thank you very much for that. So what it means to me, I'm going to try and put that sort of in the context of the work that we do here at YUF. And the principle that we operate with is that, by and for principle. So the work that we support, the kinds of organizations that we invest in and partner with are organizations that are led by young people in community for the most part. Our priority populations are Black and Indigenous young people. And so we directly, we prioritize and directly invest in work that is led by those communities and is doing work for those communities. So when you sort of use that as so we used to use it as our starting point in all of our engagements, our decisions around investment. That really allows us to look past some of the classifications of whether a group is non-charitable or not. Right? It allows us to really focus in on what they're trying to achieve and what capacities they have, and can put back into their communities to take advantage of opportunities that exist, solve whatever problems that are aching them, and be able to lift the narrative and redefine what the story is for their communities by themselves. Right. So I would say that's a major way that our behavior and our relationship with our grantees and the groups that we work with is shaped. I think that has a huge impact on, pardon the pun, has a huge impact on the social impact landscape. I think we've spent a lot of time trying to understand what social impact looks like. We've spent a lot of time telling people what social impact is, and sometimes the people that we're telling are folks who have lived experience of the things that are sometimes most removed from the resources and the places where decisions are made that have the impact in communities, right? So when you center the communities that you are working in the decision making, in the resource allocation, in the prioritization of the kind of work that gets done, I think that has a huge knock-on effect on what decisions get made in the future. It has a huge effect on actually redefining the landscape of who's talking about what social impact is, and exactly what impact is being prioritized and celebrated in community.
Great, thank you. If we can move on to Bridget, same question. Maybe I'll repeat the question is, how do non-charity groups and organizations contribute to Canada's social impact landscape?
Yeah, so in wearing the two hats that I do, working in a very large established organization, it can be very difficult for some of our larger organizations to pivot and move at the pace that community needs us to. And we've seen that, despite the fact that most of our well-established organizations grew out of very similar grassroots organizing, as we grow larger and larger, our processes become less and less accessible and less influenced by those that are experiencing the issues on the ground that the agencies are meant to address. So by funding directly grassroots organizations, we are in many ways shortening that gap, that time gap, and sometimes experiential gap between when an issue is happening on the ground and needs response and when response can be implemented. Grassroots organizers and community-based leadership, they're way ahead 99% of the time on what needs to happen, what are the community-based solutions that are going to be effective. They are led by the folks that are experiencing the issues, and I think my big push has been that established organizations really need to get behind those groups, and that they shouldn't be working kind of in parallel systems. That part of our role as larger established agencies is to ensure that others that are organizing in ways based in community and based in current and relevant issues are supported to do their best work. So I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial. And selfishly, from a large organization, I think it's crucial for our ability to remain relevant. I think there is a huge risk that as charities become bigger and larger and more encompassing, very often that government mandate, right? So there's a large mandate to merge, large mandate to do integrations across all levels of government. And as we do that more and more, we become less and less accessible. And so one of the ways that some of the motivation behind my work is to think, well, how do we make all of these larger agencies still be relevant or be doing work that is grounded in what people need? And I think that we have an obligation to support grassroots organizers that are very often doing this on the side of their other work and off the side of many other incredible responsibilities. So I think there's an obligation to your question, Hanifa, first of all. Second of all, I think there's an incredible benefit on all levels of society and community when people are able to speak freely and advocate on behalf of the issues that they're affected by and the systems that can very negatively affect people's lives. And if larger agencies feel that they can't do advocacy work, then we certainly should be supporting those who do feel like they can do the advocacy work. And so those are two of the big pieces that motivate the ways in which I do the work within our organization.
Great, thank you, Bridget. Ajeev, same question. How do non-charity groups and organizations contribute to Canada's social landscape from your experience?
Yeah, I think the definition of like social impact landscape can mean many different things to many people. I think about it as social justice and social transformation. And that's really where I see the work of non-qualified donees, non-charitable groups doing really making a huge impact. They act as a bridge between, I think, the reality that is faced by people in communities experiencing oppression and marginalization. And they're that bridge to that brilliant piece that Bridget had just shared, kind of this more encompassing sector and of the nonprofit space and the charitable sector. And it's typical, we see that, non-charities are as Bridget was sharing, the kind of, they're leading the way in terms of what needs to change. And oftentimes what we see in the nonprofit sector is we're able to dilute, what we often do is dilute that down. We dilute that down, we polish it up, and when it's something we feel comfortable with, we package it and pitch it as a proposal for a grant, and we get that money, as opposed to the work of the non-qualified donee. So, I think what they do is they push the sector to be better at what it's supposed to be doing. This work of non-qualified donees is really led by Black, Indigenous, and colored bodies who are doing the labor, the education, the protesting, the strategizing, mobilizing, policy, advising. They're the knowledge producers that are the ones who create the new ways of doing, the new ways of being, how we're able to be unbridled as a sector, to envision what's possible. And they do this while being on the receiving ends of the oppression and the marginalization. And I think, so when I think of the contributions of non-qualified donees, they're really spearheading transformational social change and doing it while going against a system that's been designed to really hoard and preserve wealth, and in particular from them. So I am just in admiration for the work that they're doing.
Great, thank you, Ajeev. Michelle, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, there's not a lot to add, but there are a few things I would say. First of all, I agree with the other panelists speaking very eloquently about grassroots organizations and the importance of working with them and providing funding and support. I think there are a couple of other groups of non-qualified donees that also contribute, make a social impact that we've funded in the past. Two in particular. So for instance, there are nonprofits that have very specialized knowledge. When we were funding with the Calgary Fetal Alcohol Network, one of the non-qualified donees or non-charities that we work closely with was a nonprofit clinic that specialized in doing assessments, FASD assessments. And we were able to provide them with funding so that they could do those for free. They're very expensive and, as I say, very specialized for low-income individuals. So they were really making an impact, but they weren't considered a charity. And then the other group that I think we need to be aware of, that I've always been a little puzzled about how to get money to, is networks. I think there are some very important, sophisticated networks in our society, and they're actually doing the things that we funders say we want organizations to do, right? They're working together, they're making sure there's not duplication of service, they're promoting best practices, they're moving their field forward, and they're trying to do it in an efficient, collaborative way, but they often don't have charitable status. But their contribution to their particular fields is enormous. And I think that that kind of collaboration, partnership, innovation, development of best practices is something that we really want to foster and support. So I think that's another group of non-charities that it's important for us as funders to be aware of and to support. That work is very time-consuming, and it needs resources. And we often expect those organizations to absorb those costs. But I think there's ways that we could support them.
Thank you, Michelle, and to our panelists for all sharing such unique experiences as to what it means to them about working with non-qualified donees or non-charities in the context of Canada's social landscape. This next question, I suspect, is one of the many reasons, if not the reason, why people are joining this panel call today, and it's on the how. How have you experienced the shifts internal to your organizations to allow for working with non-charities? And if you could spend a few extra minutes on talking about any mechanisms or ways of business that you think our audience could benefit from. I will plug that PFC is working on a toolkit that will be released that most likely, if not will, include all of the mechanisms and tools and policies that each of the organizations today have developed within their organization linked to that guide. So if this time we could start with Ajeev, can you tell us a little bit about what does the how look like based on your experience in terms of working with non-charities?
I can share from Center for Connected Communities perspective, and I'll spend some time, I think, on some good practices that we've done that I think are transferable to other organizations, including funders. And then I invite anybody to follow up with me in regards to my late law experience as well and being in the minutia of doing that work as it relates to getting money to non-qualified donees. At C3, we're not funders and we don't grant. We're actually a project on the Make Way, previously Tides Canada shared platform. And so, when we talk about working with non-qualified donees and grassroots groups, we're hearing these language interchangeably. We work at a neighborhood scale, and grassroots groups are really, in our definition of it, like autonomous grassroots leaders, people who are just going off and doing social justice work as autonomous people. And working with them has really given us a good understanding of kind of how philanthropy narrows the work that needs to be done around social transformation, because it defines what is and it isn't considered acceptable around what can or can't be funded. And because of our scope of work, because we work in complexity with a myriad of stakeholders and actors, it gives us different vantage points from seeing how grassroots groups are experiencing barriers to accessing funding, how philanthropy is having barriers, those who want to grant to non-qualified donees are having barriers accessing that, how governments are having barriers accessing non-qualified donees and more. And so we're constantly in this in-between space of seeing how these barriers exist in complexity and with the systems that we're working within. And so, as C3 has emerged out of community development practice of the storefront that's been around for 2 decades, and over that time has been a lot of deep reflection around what are kind of core principles and values around good community development. There's, I have issues with the language of best practice because I think there are many ways of doing, and I think there's only so much you can learn before you have to turn to learn from others. And so really our theory of change outlines principles and values and process to help create that path together. And so whenever one of those kind of organizations that has a solutions emerge naturally from the ground up and through good, authentic process over time. some of the values that we've learned to center in our work over the course of a couple of decades of community development work are humility, trust, hope and optimism, curiosity, continuous learning, and a commitment to equity. All of this is kind of sets the stage for some of the ways in which we got to the how-to. I mentioned earlier, the storefront ran a kind of shared platform model between 2010 and 2015 called Neighborhood Trust, and Neighborhood Trust is a shared platform. Bridget also spoke to that briefly as well. There are many models to shared platforms. This one happened in a geographic specific location, so in a neighborhood in East Scarborough, where the storefront was able to go beyond just being an organization to trustee with as a non-qualified donee, to support accessibility to access funding, so support with grant writing as they needed it, mentorship, capacity building. All of these things are rooted in deep relationships over time. So I encourage folks to kind of check out this neighborhood trust model, because it was a practice that had to sunset because of a lack of funding, but shared platforms are a really promising approach to shift power. And kind of, you know, the way in which funders now try to get money to non-qualified donees is that they ask them to find a trustee to partner with. And that is rooted in so many flawed kind of just practices around, you know, asking folks to give another organization power over a project of theirs and force a relationship to kind of exist in order to chase funds. And so there are many ways to do shared platforms. I think one of my how-tos is for funders to reinvest in models of shared platforms. Over the last decade, we had a big influx of funding on shared platforms, a lot of research, a lot of academic papers kind of came out around them. And then now we're seeing philanthropy retreat a little bit from shared platforms from my perspective. I know a big funder in the province of Ontario has actually stopped identifying shared platforms as an eligible charitable organization to receive funding. So that how-to about being able to get money into the hands of non-qualified donees, we're actually backpedaling. We're actually moving back in time, I think, in a lot of ways. And so I really encourage folks to take a look at shared platforms and promising models to kind of invest in. Another example of kind of creating kind of the opportunity to support grassroots groups is something that we're working on at Center for Connected Communities. And to Michelle's point, the power of networks. So we do support a network called the Local Champions Network. And they are really a network of autonomous grassroots leaders in Toronto, working towards kind of collective action for social transformation. And by working with this network, it enables them to design really how they want the outcomes to look. And it's messy and it's imperfect, but it's a step in kind of a direction, because as C3, as a nonprofit that is connected to a charitable organization, we're able to get funds into the hands of this autonomous network of grassroots leaders. And the Toronto Foundation has really been a big champion as they've been struggling to kind of figure out how to fund non-qualified donees. This has been kind of one way to do that. The last thing I'll share is at C3, non-qualified donees are so core to our work that they occupy leadership positions within our organization, and it would be really exciting if foundations consider this as well. So they are on our steering committee and they occupy working groups. And so because of that, because we're working in this messy space, because our work is not perfect, they're also able to hold us accountable to the work that we're doing in this space because they occupy positions of power. Laidlaw Foundation, my colleague Anna Skinner did a great job in partnership with the advisors on the Indigenous Youth and Community Futures Fund, who were Indigenous young people, on co-designing this granting program of moving colonial wealth to be funding land, language, and culture immersion programs for Indigenous young people across Ontario. And what we did there was we were able to kind of delegate decision-making authority over to an advisory group of Indigenous young people to review applications, meet and adjudicate and make decisions to provide recommendations to the board to be approved. That's another kind of how-to of kind of how foundations might be able to shift power into the hands of the people who we're supposed to be serving. So I'll stop there for the how-tos, but really encourage folks to hit me up, send me an email to continue chatting about this, because there's a multitude of ways that we did it over at Laidlaw, and we're doing it now at C3.
Thank you, Ajit. I'm going to turn it over to Bridget, recognizing that you mentioned Laidlaw, but Bridget, can you speak a little bit to how Laidlaw's work has related and connected to movement building, especially recognizing that the types of groups that Laidlaw has funded traditionally in the past?
Yes. And to add to the number of things that I'm dealing with at my house, it is now a massive storm outside with thunder and lightning. And so I feel like, so if you can't hear me, you may want to come back to me, but let me start. So to the how, I'm speaking from a Laidlaw perspective for a minute. It's very different organizationally, those who trustee and that relationship that Ajit has spoke to, and the complexity of those relationships. But from a Laidlaw perspective, in moving granting out of traditional means or traditional ways of doing granting requires a whole lot of things. It requires the ways in which accessibility and usability of your streams and the ways in which people can engage with your granting needs to impact the entire way that your organization, your foundation is granting. And that can be as simple as the ways in which people apply for money. It can be as simple as where you advertise that there's the options of applying for money, but it also can mean that you have to ensure that the staff, the board, and the grant and the committees of the foundation represent the diversity and lived experience of the grantees that you're hoping to receive, or else it's very hard to go against that traditional mindset. And the same types of grants that have always gotten through those processes will continue to be the ones to get through those processes, unless you're changing all of the other instruments that led up to that granting stream and that donee being successful. And so that's a quick thing to say. It's a long life of work. I think that it's to have the board, to have your granting committees, to have the ways in which people can access funds, the way that we have our expectations on how they report on those funds, what they do with those funds. All of that has to be looked at from an accessibility and equity lens. And I'll hear that. It's very beautiful. I'll show you outside just to spice up the crazy. It's literally lightning. I feel like it's but I'll keep going. And so I say that in that I think it is a very core foundational decision that foundations need to make for themselves. It is not an add-on. It's not an equity position that you put inside as a staff, lone staff position within your organization. It is not a anti-oppression training that you do with your board. It is very foundational in the thinking, in the workings, in the policies, the ways in which you structure your granting, or else the same types of proposals led by the same folks will continue to be granted. And so maybe we can talk more about that if there's questions, but I think maybe I'll leave it there. It's a little intenser slide. I'll let someone else jump in.
Thank you, Bridget. Ikem, would you like to share, what's the how look like at OTF, recognizing that centering Black and Indigenous youth have been such a core priority of the work? How has OTF worked to ensure that that centering is a core principle, but also embedded in the practice of the how?
Thank you. So specifically to the work here at the Youth Opportunities Fund, the one place I'll speak to in terms of the how is when it comes to our outreach, which is actually what we're about to embark on. I think our outreach season, we call it, launches in a week from today. And the ways we focus what communities we engage in, where we actually, well, not physically now, but virtually go to share the information about upcoming funding opportunities, to be very clear about what is possible with the grants that we make. I mean, for instance, when we talk about investing in grassroots groups, the grants that we make in our Youth Innovations Fund literally are, we're looking at, as long as it's more than 2 young people who have come together in a community to address a particular question, problem, or issue that they want to look at. We have two kinds of grants. One is called Test and one is Scale. And they sound exactly as the name suggests. If you've got an idea that you want to test and see if it works in your community, let's externalize that. Let's set aside that idea of having to become an organization in order to do good work, or having to yoke on organizational structures in order to take advantage of your knowledge and your experience to solve a problem that you've seen. So what we do in terms of outreach is literally reaching out as individuals. My colleagues on our team have, over the years, been developing deep-seated relationships with community agencies, community groups, neighborhood organizations, and just individuals in the communities that we live in and work in, to make sure that we're tapped into what is happening on a day-to-day basis in community, and what the kinds of questions that are coming to us from community. And we don't just see them when they show up in applications. I think that's been a bit of the thing that drives the way our outreach conversations happen. The other thing that I will also talk about is when the grant has been made on our capacity building side, again, because some of these organizations some of these groups are maybe running a project for the very first time with public funding. We make sure that we embed supports on an ongoing basis and a just-in-time basis to answer whatever questions may be coming up. So we've got folks who are in the middle of their projects and trying to figure out, okay, so how do I get better at project management, for instance? So how do I get better at marketing or using social media to connect to the communities that I want to reach out to? So we embed milestones and touch points throughout the life of the grant to make sure that we can financially support in terms of knowledge and connecting them with people to build and support their capacity to do the things that keep coming up that they don't know how to do in a particular way, or the structures that we've built around delivering a project suggest that the ways they know how to do things are not legitimate or not the right way to do it. So a bit of the dance for us is figuring out how we push money and resource into supporting people's capacity, and also knowing how and when to get out of the way with our definitions and restrictions so that they can do the work that they're very capable of doing.
Thank you, and very insightful to hear how internal to an institution change happens, and especially when you're thinking about whose voice you're centering when you're thinking about the change itself. We're gonna end this round of questions with Michelle, and then we're gonna lead into sort of a lightning round of what do we do next? So Michelle.
Okay, I'll be quick because I think we've covered a lot of ground, but maybe I'll be a little bit more technical because I think that building on what Ajib and Bridget both said, first of all, our regulations that we're governed by in Canada are a little frustrating, and they do create some sort of those false partnerships that Ajib was talking about. And I think, as Bridget said, before you enter into this work, you really have to do some internal work. So for me, part of it was I spent more time trying to understand CRA regulations than I ever thought I would in my life, and became a little bit of a CRA geek. So, you know, I think if as a foundation, you want to give funds directly to a non-qualified donee, which you can do, there are things you have to understand. Right? You have to understand what direction and control means. You have to understand what kind of processes and procedures you have in place. I think you have to have a good conversation with your board about what your policy is, about when you will give out this funding and how you will go about it. Because people are nervous about this, and there has to be some risk mitigation going on. And then I think what we did after immersing ourselves in arcane CRA regulations is we worked with Laird Hunter, and we developed many of the documents and policies and procedures that you'll see in the handbook. And this sounds really bureaucratic, and it was very bureaucratic and legal, but what it did do, I think, was then gave us the freedom to move forward with grants like this, because we were confident in what we were doing, and we could then also explain to people what the expectations were and what was going to happen. So I think that all sounds very boring, but I often think that if you understand the environment that you're working in and can figure out how to make it work within the constraints that we're currently under, then you can actually move forward. And that's part of what our group in Calgary was trying to do, is make people understand that you can do this, and you can move forward if you understand what's involved. And then finally, more to the values point, I was thinking about when we mostly work with non-qualified donees, and it's usually when we're doing larger collaborative initiatives, and we can we really need all voices at that table. So for instance, we had a collab funding around fetal alcohol, trying to get systems change and move that issue forward in Calgary. We have a collaborative fund. We had a collaborative funders table about improving out-of-school programs for vulnerable youth. And I think you can't do that kind of work if you only have certain voices at the table. You have to have a diversity of voices, and by understanding how to get funding out to those groups, then you can invite a diversity of voices to the table.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Michelle, do you want to turn that into an additional follow-up on what do we do to sort of, what's your call to action for philanthropy right now, as many organizations are in a position of contemplating what next means in terms of working with non-charities?
Sure. Well, I think Hanif has passed it over to me, because I had a little rant when we were doing our warm-up for this, because I do think we have an opportunity right now as a sector. I think that our rules, and I don't think that there's any dispute about this. You've seen many analysis and reports that they're antiquated, that this idea of direction and control is a very paternalistic. It limits real true partnership, and limits innovation. It limits bringing grassroots groups into the circle. But there's an opportunity now. There are a few things that have come out recently. There's the Senate report on the charitable sector, which really looks to modernizing our sector with some really good recommendations about how we can bring the sector forward and bring our legislation, our regulations forward. And then the Pencil Case Foundation, I hope I pronounced that properly, recently released a very interesting report, interesting to me because I'm a geek on this, about these regulations, about direction and control, and about how charities can work with non-charities, but specifically about how funders could work with non-qualified donees. With just some changes to regulations, it could become a lot easier, and we could really open the circle of groups that get support and that we work with, and that we can help to move forward and put their ideas and their recommendations for change forward. So I think we have an opportunity. We've got some really specific and good recommendations, so we could get behind those, I think, and if the government would adopt them, and I don't even think that they would be that controversial to adopt, then I think we would see a big improvement. And finally, our handbook would be out of date, which is what I'm looking for, and we would have a much more modern system. Many other countries have a more modern system than we have, and I think we could emulate that. So that's my little I'm on the soapbox.
Great, thank you. And great call for advocacy on the part of foundations to help move forward some of those changes. I'm going to be a little bit more...
Sorry, I just want to give a little kudos to PFC because they are working on this. Mm-hmm. And I know that there was we participated in a campaign to try and get it in the mandate letters of the new cabinet. So I'm not saying no one's working on it, but definitely organizations are.
Great, thank you for the clarification. I'm going to be slightly more pushy with the next panelist, given the time. So Ajeev, what's your call to action for those who are participating in today's call?
I guess I'll be a slightly more faster then. So yes, everything Michelle said in terms of regulatory changes needs to happen. I'm also going to say look towards the experts who are already doing a lot of this work. The Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal people in Canada are amazing people. Pay them to help you figure out answers to these questions. Next Gen Philanthropic Collective is another network of folks who are thinking about social justice, philanthropy, and the principles of that. And also in the meantime, there are people who are moving money to non-qualified donees already. So OIP, the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Program, are regranting to Indigenous young people. So fund them to do some of this as well. I'll drop a link in the chat box, a fourth quadrant article on investing through emergence. So what happens when grant makers take an emergent approach to grant making? It's pretty transformative and it's very cool. I think folks should check it out. And I will end with shared platforms. They are awesome. They have been kind of left to whittle away. We need deep investment over a long period of time to kind of explore shared platform models more thoroughly and to learn and make mistakes and continue. And we're totally happy to be a part of that journey with folks. So that's all I'll say. The only other thing is that it would be really awesome if we had, as a part of this series, a panel for non-qualified donees exclusively to learn from them about what philanthropy needs to do to change.
Thank you, Ajeev. Bridget, I suspect you're there, even with the black screen. You're on mute. Okay, there we go.
I'm off mute now. I think there's some, I absolutely agree around the shared platforms and needing to reinvest in that process. And I think there's some incredible repair work that needs to happen in regards to a trusteeship relationship. And that I think there's some, I think instead of kind of throwing out that system, I think we need to hold larger agencies accountable for doing that process well and to doing it really collaboratively and really supporting the success of the organizations that you're trusteeing. And I believe strongly in that relationship. And I think that, you know, I'm in constant consultation with all of the groups that we trustee. And I hear such relief to have infrastructure that is usable to them, that makes their work easier. But at the same time, I also hear from them that they've had other trusteeships that they have felt were a very disruptive relationship. And so my goal is, how do we do trusteeship in a way that we don't need, you know, a new 500 organizations popping up across Canada every month. What we need is for our sector to be better at supporting non-qualified donees, if that's what we're calling them. And so just to add to what's been said is, I'd like to not throw out that model, and I'd like to repair that model and make sure that it's working for grassroots organizations and what they need out of our charitable sector.
Thank you, Bridget, and very well said. Ikem, would you like to take us home for this webinar today?
Yes, I agree with all that my fellow panelists have said. I would add that it is important to continue to hold these systems and institutions and structures that we talk about accountable for being better. So embedded in this conversations is continuing to identify what are the things that we are not doing as well as we've said we want to do and commit to doing. This conversation about shared platforms is certainly one of them. Improving how it is that we understand, you know, trusteeships and supporting trusteeships to be relationships and not just relationships of convenience, and relationships that get entered into when there is a funding opportunity available. But that the key word in that relationship is actually trust, and that gets developed and built over time, and can be very easily severed if things are not done properly and resourced properly. And that's, you know, pointing the finger back at us as funders to do that resourcing in a sustained manner And the invitation for you to also to keep reminding us of when we're not doing it properly and doing it in a sustained manner. Many foundations like the one that I work with also have opportunities for members of the public to be part of our decision-making process and be part of our boards to some extent. So if you can, if you have the time, interest, and ability to do so, find a way to enter into these processes of decision-making and into these rooms where the conversations and decisions are made that impact you and the communities that we work in.
Thank you all to our thank you to our panelists for such wise words of wisdom around the importance of continuing to advocate for regulatory and systemic change, for recognizing that for systems to change, diverse voices and experiences need to be at those tables where change and decision-making is happening, and that this is not only about supporting non-qualified donees with the resources of philanthropy, but it's about investing in a system that's accepting of working with those organizations as well. And so with that, I would like to end today's conversation. I really appreciate everyone's participation today. Again, thank you so much to PFC and to all of our panelists for joining us today. And please look out for the upcoming resource from PFC on many of the technical components, but also the tools and resources of how to go about doing this work as an institution and as a foundation that will be linked to that guide moving forward. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Bridget, stay dry. I'm looking at the same rain as you are.
So Hanifa, if I could just, before everybody signs off, just to let everybody know that we do have another webinar. We're going to be skipping a week for the first time since March, but we do have an upcoming webinar on July 22nd on COVID and climate change. So if any of the participants are interested, please feel free to join us. And I wanted to say thank you to Hanifa for the terrific job in facilitating this conversation. And of course, thank you to our panelists. And we hope you can join us next time. So thanks, everyone. And take care. Be healthy. Bye.